Welcome to Goldfish on Games, where today we're going to be checking out one of the best and possibly most misguided licensed title ever made. So let's battle it out with the Universal Soldier. Universal Soldier was released for both the Megadrive as well as the Gameboy in 1992, and was developed by the Code Monkeys, with Ballistic handling the publishing. And outside of the music that's trying to bring the hype, it starts out with very little fanfare. There's no intro or even a hint of the story. There is just this title screen. To know what's going on, we're gonna have to go back to the manual, which can be found inside this, non-standard box. And the reason for this is actually an unlicensed game. Well, they had the license to the film, but they didn't have one from Sega, so they had to make their own carts and boxes, with the cart designed to fit in any region of the Genesis. It also had this extra label along the top to inform you that no matter what might be put on the screen, this was not authorized by Sega. And looking inside the manual, we find that a shady government group tried to make the ultimate soldier, a universal soldier, the Unisol. But something went wrong with the programming on one of them, and rather than just throwing an exception and uploading a crash dump, it went on a rampage that you had to stop. Because you two happen to have a history stretching back to Vietnam. And it's interesting that while the box mentions both the Mega Drive and Genesis, hinting at its worldwide release, the manual only mentions the Genesis. Now let's jump into the game, where the first level is set in a jungle, which I guess is vaguely in line with the film. And there isn't too much to this one. There's a few pits you can fall into, and the odd soldier for you to take down. And I can already see it in the faces of some of you. This seems familiar. Now there'll be others who already know where this is going, but keep it to yourself for now, for those that don't quite get it. Now, due to the short nature of this level, it doesn't take too long to finish, and thus we arrive at the second one, and that is the penny falling for a good number of viewers. But for those who don't recognise what's going on, this game is actually a reskin of the mighty Turrican 2. So what we've ended up with is an unlicensed film license that's actually another game with a fresh coat of paint, which I think might make this the best and worst film tie-in ever made. As Turrican 2, well, it's awesome, and they also kept most of what made that game so great. But it also has very little to do with the actual film it's meant to be based on, as most of the enemies, well, they're not even close to what was in the movie. Like, who remembers this mechanical dragon? This level, for the most part, is the same. There is still that bit with the wind, and it is still a lovely effect. And overall the artwork looks very similar to the Amiga version, which I figure must have been the base for this one. Which makes the lack of credits to any of the other developers a little bit of a shame, really. Now this is supposedly a continuation of the jungle of the last level. I don't see it myself, but you'll have to take their word for it. And it doesn't take too long to reach our first boss, a massive Andrew Scott. And damn, he must have been on the protein shakes. And taken an entire packet for each serving as well. But it is still just a reskinned version of the Turrican 2 boss. So the same tactics of standing there and just using the laser whip will take him down with very little fanfare. I bet Luke from the film wishes that he had a laser whip. It would have made those battles so much easier. At this point, you can risk going left to try and collect some of the extra 1-ups. But if you mess up the jumps, then you'll have a very long climb back up through the level that you've already done, all the while eating into that precious little time that you have left remaining. But with that, we are done with the forests of Vietnam. At least that's what the manual likes to call this world. The next one, it says, is the dam, which was a major part of the film. And starting it off is another brand new level, which isn't that long, but it is quite complicated in its design, and there's a number of areas that are quite fiddly to get into. But at least it has one of the few new baddies that they added into the game, the Unisouls. And they help highlight the health system, as you have a bar that will be reduced on touch with any of the baddies or their bullets. But that touch won't hurt them, so they can just sit in your hitbox and quickly take down your health. And there's very little indication that any of this is happening. There's no visual effect or knockback, you just have to notice it. And with another maze solved, we can enter into the dam itself. Or I think that's where we are. It's one of the issues when you're reskinning a game, you have to try and move the levels around and rework the art to try and match the story that you're trying to tell, even if it doesn't quite fit. It's the same with abilities, because if you see some small gaps, then don't worry, as our hero of the story, Luke, has learned how to roll up into a spiky ball, and thus he can travel down those small gaps, even if there's strong flowing water that's trying to push you back. The ball also has the ability to drop bombs, so there was some serious cribbing from a certain space bounty hunter. There is also an extra thing that the Turrican, as they like to call it, can do, but we'll cover that a bit later on, as right now we have another maze to solve, which requires us going under the water. And I really like how the controls change when you're down here, as you get almost direct control over where you want to go, which is quite the nice change from most water controls. The music also changes as you head into the depths, which is a lovely touch. But what I don't like is what they've done with the parallax scrolling. It just messes with my head. But the real problem is that quite often you'll think you're heading in the right direction, only to find yourself at a dead end, and it can be quite the trek to get back on track. But eventually you will come across the laser eye boss, and then you'll get to move on. Now the game continues like this for a little bit longer, but there are some fun moments like this windy shaft, as you'll have to time your jumps with the wind to get up to the top. And then you'll need to take down a series of helicopters. Now so far we've been mostly looking at the Megadrive version, but the Game Boy edition was surprisingly good. The levels look nice and clean, considering the lower colour palette, and it throws around quite the number of sprites and effects on screen, all of which doesn't noticeably slow things down. Now this is the version I actually played back in the day, and I have to say they did a very good job of it. As it seems to be a more or less one-to-one conversion from the console edition, which means there's quite a lot of content for a handheld game. It was also not the only Nintendo version they worked on, as a port to the Super Nintendo was in progress, but it was then scrapped, but an incomplete version did get leaked. And it's interesting to play as it does look quite good, even if the sound feels like a bit of a step down. It really does sound quite bad and echoey. I'm not sure if they planned it to sound like that or if it's just an issue that they hadn't fixed yet, but it is quite interesting to check out. And I wonder if any of this was the basis for Super Turrican. And with us finally getting outside the dam, we just have to deal with a truck and some very brave riot soldiers. And then we're on to the third world, the desert, which starts us on another new level, set near an old hotel and junkyard. Now these levels sort of take the place of the shooter ones from the original, but at the same time they also dropped a few of the other levels and rearranged them to help with their basic narrative, so it's not completely the same as Turrican 2. But what was brought over almost identically was the weapons, that I most likely won't need to go into too much detail, but there are quite a few weapons and power-ups in the game to talk about. Because you will find these capsules that float around, or these boxes that can be hidden, both of which will drop icons when shot. And this can give you one of 3 basic weapons, and that includes the typical spread shot, a laser, and possibly the more interesting, if not always as useful, bouncer. There's also icons to extend the range of your whip, or even give you more spread attacks. These can be very useful for trying to take down baddies that you can't quite get with your bullets or your whip. But there's also an instant smart bomb. And while we're going around the desert, obviously we're going to need to see some purple levels. And this one will force us to use the Turrican more often, as there's more hidden passages to deal with than ever before. And those bombs, well, they might help you get around them as well. The gameplay overall is still very similar to what we've seen before though. But what is a little bit more interesting is the backgrounds, as we're starting to see spinning cogs and far more creative uses of that extra background layer. And as we've been using the Turrican more, I think it's time to show off its special attack with a boss fight, as it turns into this screen-filling bouncing hellball that just throws firepower in all directions, and can be very useful for clearing a screen or taking down a boss in almost one go. But it can only be used once per life, but as we've seen, it will deal some serious damage. More serious than the last levels anyway, as they go into an alien spaceship or something. Well, they tried to call it the enemy HQ in the manual, but really, who are they trying to kid with these types of baddies that we're facing? And the environment. This is wearing its Turrican 2 skin a little too tightly here. But I have to say, as we're reaching the end of the game, this isn't all bad. Yeah, it wasn't the best basis for a Universal Soldier game, but if we look past that to just the game itself, then it's actually very decent. And the audio is really well done, with some really good YM versions of the musical tracks. And it also has the voice samples. And as I mentioned, the extra background work has been nicely done and fits in with the levels more than we've seen in some games that added it. And they even found the time to add a password system, so you don't have to replay the whole game. Is this the worst game ever made? Well, obviously not. It had an excellent base. But the question is, should they have stuck with that base, rather than trying to rebrand it with Universal Soldier? Yeah, I think they should have done, because they gained absolutely nothing with the Unisol branding. I don't think it sold any better than the original Turrican. And so I think we're going to have to leave it there. So until next time, I was the Goldfish, that was not the Turrican 2, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thanks for watching. I know this is a bit of a different video to what I would normally do, but I liked the weird subject matter and how it linked back to a more well-known Amiga title. And if you enjoyed this, then YouTube has some buttons that'll let it and me know. Or you can check out 2 other videos that you can see on the screen right now.